afternoon. Again, my name is Peter Greenwald. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor for the South Coast Air Quality Management District. I have a presentation here for you today regarding some of the key air quality and transportation challenges as well as energy challenges we face in Southern California. It's a real pleasure to be here in Portland. I do visit here every now and then. My sister lives here. I have to say I'm here with a bit of a sense of irony because I feel that Los Angeles has more to learn from Portland than Portland has to learn from Los Angeles when it comes to livable communities and the environment. But we are pushing the envelope in Southern California in a lot of ways, and I think that there are some lessons that would be important for many areas around the country as well as the world to learn. A little bit of background. The agency I work for, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, is a government regulatory agency that is responsible for achieving federal clean air standards in the greater Los Angeles area. This is an area with over 17 million residents. If it were a state, it would be the 5th largest state in the country. It has the worst air quality in the country still, despite very substantial reductions in air pollution over recent decades. We've got millions of cars and heavy-duty vehicles. Our region is the nation's largest freight gateway for imported goods. And our air quality problems are in part a result of the topography, the meteorology we have, basically ringed by mountains and with strong inversion layers. The presentation that I have for you today will be, first I'll be describing the air quality and transportation settings that exist in Southern California, some of the challenges that we face looking forward, the importance of clean energy in resolving those challenges, and a vision for the future and how we see mechanisms to make that happen. As you can tell, I have a PowerPoint, which I'll stick to, but please feel free to ask a question or make a comment at any time as we go along. I'll be happy to do that. And just one more introductory item just about myself. My position, Senior Policy Advisor, probably does not tell you anything about or indicate anything about what I actually do for a living. My background is in the law. For many years, I was General Counsel for the Air Quality District, and am now in a policy role, which is, I got to tell you, a lot more fun. If any of you are thinking of a career in either environmental studies, environmental policy, or the law, I'd be happy to talk to you about it, about the career and what makes a fun career and not a fun career after the presentation. So let's get into the presentation. I usually put this photo at the end of a presentation because I think there's some good messages here about the importance of good long-term planning. But since I'm not at home and I'm giving us some introduction to Southern California's issues, I thought I'd put it up front. This is a pile of scrapped red cars. The red cars were trolley cars. They were powered by electricity. It was a system that was built from about 1900 through much of the last century. And by 1944, at its peak, the system was absolutely huge. There was over 1,000 miles of track, over 100 million riders, more riders than we have currently in all the rail systems that exist today in Southern California. And then by 1961, it was all destroyed. It was all scrapped as the region embarked on a program of building freeways and roads based upon internal combustion engine power. And what has resulted from the decisions to scrap that kind of a system, as well as many other land use decisions in Southern California, is basically this. This is what you see when you fly into the Los Angeles area. Many, many miles of sprawl. Down there's about 100 different cities. It's frequently difficult to tell when you leave one city and arrive in another city. And along with it, we have very serious traffic congestion problems. And this is not just a problem for passengers, but also for freight movement. The Southern California region is the home to the 2 largest ports in the United States, the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach. Collectively, about 44% of the containerized imports to the nation come through those ports, and that's a pretty staggering figure when you think about how much is actually imported, all the imported goods that we have coming to this country. I mean, you just go down the aisles of Walmart or Target or I imagine Fred Meyer, and you'll see how much stuff we import. Well, the delays that are caused by the kinds of congestion that we have for freight are a serious issue for shippers. And this is a big part, freight movement is a big part of the economy in Southern California. And so a very, very important issue in Southern California is finding sufficient capacity to speedily and reliably move freight. The ports are enormous. They are, this is the two ports from the air, from the ground. You can see as we move inland, there are enormous rail yards and freeway systems at various locations throughout Southern California. Really, this defines much of what you see on the freeways and other roads that we have in the greater Los Angeles area. That is the beginning of a system of rail traffic that extends across the country, and you can see some of the rail flows here. In addition to the traffic congestion that we have from the land use patterns we have and the kinds of transportation systems we have, we've got, as I mentioned earlier, the worst air pollution in the country. This is a photo that was taken in the 1950s. This is what happens when you put millions of vehicles with no air pollution controls into the relatively enclosed bowl that we call the South Coast Air Basin. Now, the situation has improved quite a bit since the 1950s. This is a more typical view. Looking out towards the east. I took this photo in the hill behind the port areas looking east. And after I shot the photo, I called our meteorologist. The air quality district has over 800 employees. Many of them are lawyers, but also a lot of technical staff, including meteorologists. I called one of our meteorologists and said, well, how's the air quality today? And he said, well, it's actually very, very good. And so I said, well, very good. What's that schmutz out there on the horizon? Forgive me if I drop into using technical jargon. And this is, he responded, and this is an exact quote, that the air is clean enough today so that you can see the pollution. And I thought, okay, I thought that said a lot. So we're now at a point where the air is clean enough so you can see the pollution. The worst air pollution is in the inland areas because we have prevailing onshore winds. This is the buildup of one pollutant, ozone, in the inland areas over one particularly smoggy day a few years back. The good news is that the levels have been dropping due to very stringent air pollution control measures over the years. This chart shows the number of days of exceedance of the federal ozone standard, which is traditionally called smog. The good news is we've gone from over 200 days in the 70s to just about 15 days last year of exceedance of the original ozone standard. The bad news is that as medical research has progressed, the federal government has adopted progressively tighter standards, and so the latest standard, we actually have over 100 days out of every year, which exceeds that health-based standard. And there's severe health consequences to this, thousands of premature deaths, lives cut short by over 10 years, as well as asthma, cardiovascular disease, and many, many other adverse impacts. We also have millions of people who live in close proximity to freight movement, and they are exposed to diesel particulate matter, which is a particular problem in localized areas. The impacts of diesel particulate matter are concentrated around rail yards and highways and ports. They drop off relatively quickly as you move away. But we have many people who live very close. I mean, this is one neighborhood next to one of the ports near the rail yards, and you can see how close folks live to some of these diesel facilities. They use a lot of diesel equipment. The South Coast District has mapped out cancer risks from air pollution throughout the region. This is the result of what we call the multiple air toxics exposure study. This is the last one we did was in 2008. We're updating it this year. We're going to be coming out with a new one very, very shortly. Basically, the darker colors show the higher cancer risk. This particular map is without the impact of diesel particulate. So this is everything from perchloroethylene to other toxics that you would see in general use. If you add in the diesel, it looks like this. The highest cancer risks are in the areas of darker color, that big blob down here at the bottom here, that's over the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach due to the concentration of ships and trains and trucks there. This particular line out here is the main shipping route from Asia coming into the ports. If you look at a high-resolution version of this photo, of this image, you can actually make out the roads, the main transportation arterials, the freeways, the rail lines, and such. Average cancer risks were found back in 2005, this is 2005 data, to be over 1,000 in a million. So if you're familiar with environmental regulation, you frequently hear about standards such as 1 in a million or 10 in a million. The highest standard I'm aware of is 25 in a million. Well, so over 1,000 in a million is very, very significant cancer risks. Also a big political issue. If you take a map of low-income areas in Southern California and you overlay it on this map, you will find a very high degree of correlation. That is an environmental justice issue, and it is a big political issue in Southern California, particularly with efforts to expand highways and rail yards and ports in ways that communities near those facilities are cause concern about health impacts of the pollution. The vast majority of risk that we found in this study was about 84% was from diesel particulate matter emissions. The good news here, though, is that since that time, emissions have been coming down rather substantially. This is an excerpt from the Clean Air Action Plan adopted by the two ports, Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, showing diesel particulate matter emissions. The bottom line is they've dropped 72% since the time that map was created through a number of measures such as banning older trucks and requiring cleaner fuels for the ships and many other kinds of measures. This is one of the areas that we're working very, very aggressively in order to cut down on particularly those diesel emissions. And then finally, just looking forward, there is a good deal of research being undertaken right now on the issue of ultrafine particulates. These are particles less than 1/10 of a micron in diameter. A lot of research going on at UCLA and other places. There are no standards for ultrafine particulates, but they are created by combustion processes and are emitted by diesel trucks and other types of diesel equipment. The big issue is that these particles are so small they get into the bloodstream and indeed can get into cells and even into cell structures. And in the laboratory, that has caused certain cell structures to actually be destroyed. So this is an emerging issue for the future in terms of research and potential new standards. So that's the setting that we're in right now. Now looking forward, in terms of air quality, our biggest challenges are reducing particulate matter from mobile sources, but the most daunting challenge of all is reducing nitrogen oxides emissions from mobile sources. Nitrogen oxides are created by combustion, and they contribute, they react in the atmosphere to form ozone as well as fine particulates. Our current levels of ozone, which is the main driver of our air pollution control programs right now, are about 112 parts per billion. The federal standard, which has to be attained under federal law, is by 2023 is 80 parts per billion. There's a second federal standard that has to be attained by around 2031, which is 75 parts per billion. You might have heard a few months ago that the Obama administration put off a decision on tightening the ozone standard, and it was very controversial. They put it off till 2013, and that would have been in the range of 60 to 70 parts per billion. Everything else I'm going to tell you in this presentation about the air quality challenges based upon the adopted standards, though. This is not the proposed new standards. Now, as we look out to 2023, the year that we have to attain that first federal ozone standard, this is the lineup of all the top sources of nitrogen oxides. On the left, we've got ocean-going vessels, off-road equipment, heavy-duty diesel trucks. All the truck categories together are the single largest source of nitrogen oxides. Stationary sources are in this bar right here, giving an indication that the vast majority of emissions are from mobile sources. And then we go down the line, locomotives, et cetera. If we take all those bars and pile them on top of each other, this is the picture that results. If you're interested in clean energy, this is the most important slide I'm going to show you in this presentation. What this shows is that come 2023, we're going to have about 300, something north of 300 tons per day of nitrogen oxides emissions. That's with all of the rules and programs that have been adopted today on the books. It's with almost complete fleet turnover to newer vehicles. The message is, though, that in order to attain that first ozone standard by 2023, we need to get down to this horizontal red line, about 115 tons per day. So about a 2/3 reduction in nitrogen oxides beyond the benefits of all adopted rules. And then by 2031, that bumps up to about a 3/4 reduction. Virtually all sources are currently controlled by well over 90%. In some cases, like cars and trucks, they're already at 98%. There's a few exceptions, ships and locomotives being among them. But the challenge of reducing that amount of emissions is really quite daunting. It's going to require a complete change in the kinds of equipment that we operate for transportation in our region. Another way to look at it, we did some modeling showing the ozone levels that result from just 3 categories of equipment, even with the controls on the books today: ships, aircraft, and locomotives. The bottom line here is that they came up to 72 parts per billion, along with when you add in the natural background ozone. And remember, the standard for 2030 is 75, so there's only a little sliver between the top of that bar and that red line available for everything. That's your water heaters in your homes, your cars, trucks, everything. This is why we're talking about the need for transitioning to zero and near zero emission sources on a broad scale in Southern California. And we're really not going to be able to do that without transitioning to different energy sources. It's just not possible to put additional add-on control devices, such as the catalytic converters that we have currently, that would be of sufficient efficiency in order to get that level of emission control. So, key message: in the 2023 to 2031 timeframe, the region is going to need to transition to electric power and other kinds of power sources that have zero or just about zero emissions. And transportation is key because transportation creates about 90% of the NOx pollution. So there's a number of other drivers for switching to cleaner energy in transportation in particular in Southern California. One is growth. Our planning policies in Southern California have generally been growth accommodating. This is in part just a recognition of reality, because most of the growth comes from people living in the area having babies. But what that does is it puts pressure on technology. What we have, our planning policies are based upon the application of cleaner and cleaner technologies. And this has been successful over the years. Emissions have dropped substantially over the last few decades. At the same time, we've had really massive growth in vehicle miles traveled, VMT, as well as population and other metrics showing growth. So that's showing that you can have economic growth at the same time as you have pollution reduction. And this is the kind of policy that we're going to be continuing out to the future. Public support for transportation infrastructure projects. As I mentioned earlier, we've got some real capacity constraints at the ports and along the highways. You saw some of those photos. So the ports, the transportation agencies are proposing projects to expand capacity for passenger as well as freight transportation. New rail yards are being proposed. These kinds of projects have engendered a large amount of public controversy, in many cases opposition and litigation. This is the China shipping terminal at the port of Los Angeles. You might have seen in the paper today that the Vice President of China visited that terminal yesterday. And among the things that he heard about were all of the environmental controls that have been employed at that particular facility. That was in part in response to litigation challenging the building and the expansion of that facility. What has happened because of all the opposition from community groups and litigation is that transportation agencies and the ports in Southern California are turning into, in a certain sense, environmental organizations, or at least are establishing efforts to reduce pollution impacts in very aggressive ways. The ports are developing a roadmap for moving towards zero and near zero emission transportation technologies. There are proposals for zero emission truck lanes along key transportation corridors. This kind of thing with the diesel exhaust is really something you're seeing less and less of in Southern California. So engendering the kind of public support needed the political support needed to approve those kinds of projects is something that is really driving moving to zero and near zero emissions. Also, climate programs. Southern California has a relatively aggressive program to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases at the state level, moving to 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. And then there's an executive order from the governor stating that California would be 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, which is a level of greenhouse gas reduction that many countries around the world have adopted as necessary to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. There are a number of programs being instituted in California. You may have heard just a couple of weeks ago, the California Resources Board, which is a statewide agency, adopted new clean car standards that will require more and more zero-emission vehicles. And there are many other kinds of programs. SB 375, if you're familiar with the Senate bill in California, which requires land use planning to reduce VMT and thereby reduce greenhouse gases. Another program that's getting a lot of attention these days. So the same kinds of measures that can reduce emissions of greenhouse gases can, if properly chosen, reduce the nitrogen oxides emissions that I mentioned earlier that are so important to local air pollution. Cutting our expenditures for foreign oil. Our region spends about $45 billion every year on fossil fuel. Most of that, about 80%, is for petroleum fuels for transportation. That's a huge drain of funds from our region. You can imagine that the biggest part of our economy is totally dependent on one single fuel. And the history of that, price volatility of that fuel is something that we expect to occur into the future. This is a chart from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. This is their annual energy outlook, and it shows oil prices fluctuating quite a bit historically. And then this is where there are projections out to the future, and they have a low and a high. And you can see that basically they don't really know. It's a very wide potential variation in oil price out to the future. We don't see that kind of price variation for electricity supplies. And so one way to reduce the kind of business uncertainty that results from fluctuating fuel prices is to move to a more diverse fuel mix, including electricity. Also, many of the countries around the world are moving towards cleaner, lower carbon technologies for a variety of reasons, energy security as well as climate. The big difference between them and Southern California is that we just need those kinds of technologies earlier because of these enforceable federal deadlines we have for air quality. We've wrapped up much of what I've been saying, as well as potential actions for the future, into a brochure which you can find online on our website, and feel free to take a look at that. But the main elements are to move to cleaner technologies, particularly in transportation. The main elements are for light-duty vehicles, and there's going to be an explosion in the next few years. That's a bad word to use here, of vehicles that run on hydrogen fuel cells. Remember when the GM put out the electric vehicle, they called it the Impact? I thought, why would you name a car that? And plug-in hybrids, fuel cell. Many of those technologies that are out there right now are finding their way into the heavy-duty sector. Remember I mentioned earlier, the biggest source category for nitrogen oxides in our area is the trucks. And so one of the areas that we are working in, funding technology projects and such, is on demonstrating heavy-duty vehicles with battery power, plug-in hybrid, fuel cell. The natural gas electric hybrids are one thing that we're expecting to work on in the very near future, and a potential for wayside power, much as if you go out here, you see the wayside electric power, the overhead catenary lines for many of the transportation systems you have here in Portland. This is also being worked on right now for heavy-duty trucks. This photo here is of a catenary truck that was developed by Siemens Corporation. That's a prototype in Germany. We are in the process of trying to get that out here to the ports. The interesting thing about that technology is it's about 100 years old. There's nothing new about it. People talk about advanced technologies, but many times what you've got in the past is really what you need. What Siemens did there was basically have a system which allows the connection to the overhead wire to be raised. There's an automatic sensor that senses the presence of the wire overhead, and that allows the driver to raise the pantograph to connect to the overhead wire. When the truck leaves the lane with the overhead wire, it automatically comes down. This can all happen at highway speeds. It's a hybrid electric truck, so it can drive off the catenary wire, potentially unlimited range, powered by diesel or battery power with a more limited range, or fuel cells. And this is one of the promising technologies because of the flexibility of range and the fact that it's primarily existing technology. Rail systems, again, considerable amount of work going on right now, evaluating not just for and deploying for passengers, but evaluating for freight transport. One of the big issues we have for freight is that if you electrify the rail system in Southern California, what about the rest of the route all the way to Chicago or anywhere else? So we're putting efforts into working with locomotive manufacturers and others to see if we can develop dual-mode locomotives for freight that could operate on electric power in our region, and then switch to diesel or other power outside of the region. There's hybrid electric technologies that are being considered, and if we have some more time, I can get into that a little bit. The infrastructure needed to power or fuel these kinds of technologies is a key need. If you're going to use overhead catenary, that of course, but also charging for battery electric vehicles, hydrogen supplies, and then energy generation and supply. We have Renewable Electricity Standard in California now. 33% of power generation will have to be through renewable sources by 2020, and it's a key effort there. If you fly into LA, you frequently see something like this: is a sea of warehouses, white roofs reflecting heat and light, and it's just a perfect place for photovoltaics. But there's very little. I mean, I was trying to find one. I finally find a little spot of what looks like solar panels there. But there's about 600 million square feet of roof space here in Southern California. If there was photovoltaics on just half of that, it would be equal to the amount on a peak summer day to the amount of electricity produced by one of the two units at our nuclear power generating station in San Onofre. A significant amount of electricity. Question that frequently comes up: if you're going to use electric power for transportation, what about the emissions from production of the electricity? This shows the emissions of nitrogen oxides in our region by fuel type. The point to make is that this little tiny sliver here, 0.3%, is electricity production. The power plants in our region are natural gas fired. They have very stringent emission controls. The main point here is that there'll be a really large reduction in emissions, even if the power is generated in our region by combustion-based power. And then final word about ocean-going vessels. Big ticket source of pollution. One of the measures being implemented right now is having those vessels plug into grid power when they're at berth at our ports. And this is one vessel that's doing this. Is China Shipping. This is one of those at the terminal that the Vice President of China saw yesterday. We need to be maximizing that, and also finding ways to bring the cleanest, newest vessels, which will have tighter NOx restrictions into our ports. I had an opportunity to go into the engine room of one of these big vessels not long ago, and it's really quite remarkable. The engine is about 5 stories tall, and they really are just an enormous source of pollution. So what needs to be done in terms of making all this happen? Key thing that's needed is sending market signals. There's so many technology developers out there that are really interested in getting into these kinds of markets, creating the kind of products that I've been talking about. But what they need is the markets. And so there are markets developing around the world. One of the key things needed in Southern California is to show that this is an area where there will definitely be a need and drivers for the deployment of those kinds of technologies. Funding, of course, always an issue. Influencing federal policies and how to foster consensus. In terms of fostering consensus, our key effort has been to attempt to focus on strategies that will provide co-benefits, benefits for multiple challenges: air pollution, climate, energy security, public support for the kinds of infrastructure, and of course the economy, so that with single investments we can serve multiple purposes. One problem is that you've got these traditional agency silos. You have transportation agencies, you have air quality agencies, et cetera, and frequently they didn't talk that well together. So this is one thing that we're seeking to overcome through becoming involved in transportation planning in a big way. I was complaining earlier about we're filing a comment letter on a transportation plan for Southern California, which, if you look at the draft, includes a wide deployment of zero and near zero emission technologies out into the future, as well as the ports and other energy plans and other types of planning. Just to give you some examples of some of the kinds of measures that we're talking about when we talk about co-benefits. For example, in air pollution, you can talk about after treatment, put on a more effective catalytic converter, but that's not going to help climate or energy security, and you can go around. But there are certain measures that are in that sweet spot that serve all of these ends, such as electrification, fuel cells, renewable energy, efficiency measures, fostering transit use. And those are the kinds of things that we are seeking to focus on. And then getting over this sort of chicken and the egg problem, where you've got a technology developer who wants to create the technology, market it, but is there going to be the fueling infrastructure available? Is there going to be the market available? Well, this is the area for regulations or port programs, project conditions, such as we've got some rail yards being proposed, and we're advocating for the agencies to impose environmental conditions on those kinds of facilities, requiring cleaner equipment. This is one way, put my lawyer hat on for a second, to get around some of the federal preemptions on local and state authority, because it's just a matter of a landlord saying, if you want to come here, you got to have the cleanest equipment. And then funding. And one of the big issues here is that many of these kinds of technologies actually are going to save money, but the savings are going to be in the long term. And the payback period, if you will, maybe 20, 30 years for some of these things. And so how do you finance major infrastructure under those kinds of circumstances? So public-private partnerships, infrastructure banks, user fees, big issue in terms of planning. So in conclusion, this is our to-do list, focusing on technology, planning, infrastructure, funding, and implementation. And normally at the end of AQMD presentations, there's a slide of a family frolicking under blue skies with big puffy clouds, and I just think it's a little bit too sappy, so I really wanted to end with this. But I've already showed you that, so I'm going to leave you with the sappy picture. So, well, thank you very much. Yes.
Port Authority? Is it the state legislature?
Yeah, we've encountered that. In fact, there's been litigation in California over that exact issue, not in connection with the landlord issue, though, but just in general. There are what are called preemptions in federal law restricting state and local authority, particularly to regulate equipment that is in interstate or foreign commerce. And there's also some very specific laws on locomotive rail operations that restrict state and local authority. But the federal courts have recognized an exception where the local government is acting as what's called a market participant, basically. And the classic example is being a landlord. And like I said, you have on public property, you're leasing out land to a railroad or to a marine terminal operator, and then in general, the landlord can impose a condition saying, you want to come here, you got to have the cleanest possible equipment. The issue of how far out, I'm not aware of that being litigated in the context of that sort of market participant theory, but it has been litigated for regulations adopted by our California Air Resources Board, limiting fuel sulfur content for those big ships that are coming to the ports. They adopted a requirement by regulation that those big ships use lower sulfur fuel within 24 miles of the coast. And they were challenged in litigation by the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association, saying that California has no authority beyond 3 miles. And that case is still being litigated, so I don't want to say too much about it. It's actually, so far the agency has won on the authority issue, but the industry has requested a hearing before the U.S. Supreme Court. And so we'll see what happens with that. So I don't have a firm answer for you, but because that may not be firmed up just yet. How about right there? Yeah.
Is there any consideration taken account into these types of policies for potential out-of-area emissions as a result of developing or manufacturing these new low-emission technologies?
Sure. One of the big issues with greenhouse gas reduction programs is emissions offsets. And if I hadn't gone through that slide with that Venn diagram so quickly, you probably could have seen that there's one of the items that we are concerned would prevent the local co-benefits for local air pollution is allowing a large amount of these offsets from foreign countries or places outside of the area. So we're really focusing on trying to find means of reducing the emissions here, offsets that are right here in our, not here in Portland, but in our area, make a lot of sense. For local pollution, you've got to have the local benefit. For greenhouse gases, not so much, but there's these other considerations, including enforceability and all kinds of others. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
I'm curious as to, I guess, what the rail capacity is in the Los Angeles area right now, and if a lot of efficiency could just be gained from the automation of systems or reduced headways or additional right-of-way on one side of the track and other. Things are not necessarily propulsion-based, but I guess getting the best benefit out of an emission rich, or excuse me, a very polluting type of resource or fuel that you can get the best bang out, best bang for your buck, as far as if you're going to keep a diesel system around for a while, could you, I guess, use that in a more wise manner?
Sure. I mean, efficiency is key. I mean, it's one of the cliche, the low-hanging fruit in terms of achieving emission reductions. Just by the way, one of the reasons why there's a couple of big new rail yard projects being proposed near the ports is to reduce the amount of truck traffic from the ports to the railheads, which can be 20 miles or more right now in some cases. And so, what you'll see if you see the commercials for the railroads on the TV is that they, with a gallon of diesel fuel, they can go a lot farther with more cargo than trucks. So that's one of the motivations for moving the rail yards closer to the ports. We'd actually like to see them in the ports, more on-dock rail, where you're just actually, that's the most efficient of all. You're taking containers right off the ships and putting them onto rail. But that's only done for a minority of the containers right now. But I totally agree. I mean, efficiency measures are key, and it's something that I think you can always work on improving the efficiency of the current system, because we're going to be stuck with diesel for a while.
You mentioned how a lot of the benefits are off in the future, and I think a lot of the benefits are also non-monetary. And so I was wondering if your strategic planning is happening in kind of a cost-benefit way, where you're looking at your reductions that way, or is it more of a benchmark approach where you're just looking at the most efficient set of strategies to reach a hard benchmark?
Well, we always have to consider the costs in developing measures. This is something state law requires us to do, and there's public analyses that have to go out, and a lot of comment on that. Ultimately, though, in the air quality realm, we are required by federal law to attain those federal standards, the ozone standard, the particulate matter standards, period. I mean, it doesn't give you an out because it costs so much. So our key struggle is to find the most economically and efficient means of getting there. But as I mentioned earlier, there is very strong indication that there could be some real benefits, even economic benefits, to moving towards cleaner energy. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to foster right now. I don't know if I answered your question, but
are you looking at going beyond the benchmarks, if possible? I mean, are there any situations where it seems worthwhile to lower them even more from an economic point of view?
Lower emissions or lower?
Yeah, lower emissions.
It's hard to get lower than zero, and that's, given that just the math of what the modeling is showing us is needed, we're going to need to get so close to that it's going beyond it. What we're focusing on are those areas where it's most technically and economically possible to achieve those levels of emissions. So, for example, you're not hearing me or anyone, our agency, talking about zero-emission aircraft. It's not going to happen in the near term. And those big ship engines, are not likely candidates. But when you look at the landside transportation, that's a different story. Cars and trucks and such, and rail. And so that's where the major focus is. Yeah.
I'm curious about the electrified freight trucks having the catenary system. And it makes sense for trains how they're in the track and it's just going to be above them the whole time. But with trucks, they might be passing or might avoid an object in the road or something. So I was curious just the physical setup of that system.
After this session, I have a little video I'd like to show you. It's from that Siemens prototype in Germany, because they have trucks having to suddenly swerve out of the lane with the overhead wire. And like I said, the way their system, this is not an advertisement for Siemens, but just showing one kind of technology that's being developed. The connection automatically retracts when that sensor sees that you're no longer in the lane, and then it can go back in. So they have trucks passing and stopping, or emergency stops, that kind of thing. And another intriguing thing is that regular vehicles could share those lanes.
So one thing that strikes me as being daunting about your task is that Prince Rupert has emerged as a major competitor to the Port of LA Long Beach, and so kind of a similar question to Alex's about cost benefits. Are there any sort of, LA Long Beach is trying to streamline everything and find ways to reduce costs to compete with a port that has a competitive advantage of being closer to China, and I'm just wondering if there are ways in your analysis of reducing air pollution to find win-wins where you can actually be streamlining and cheapening things and at the same time getting closer to this goal so that LA Long Beach can compete with other ports.
Absolutely, and I didn't use the phrase win-win, but I've used that before, and it's something that we're certainly looking for. Prince Rupert, if you look at the volumes, right now, volumes at Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach are something like 15 million 20-foot equivalent units per year. Prince Rupert is much smaller. It's not even close. But having said that, a big issue in Southern California is maintaining competitiveness. And this is one reason why there's these efforts to expand capacity, speed cargo, and again, we see the cleaner technologies as being directly tied to that. It helps prevent the local health impacts, helps to provide those kind of public support needed for that sort of thing, and we think that is a win-win. The mantra down there in the ports right now is beat the Panama Canal, because the Panama Canal is being expanded right now. By 2014, it's going to open with ability to handle the larger vessels that are now being built, and make it possible for those vessels to go from Asia through to the East Coast, to East Coast ports. And so there is an enormous effort to maintain competitiveness of our ports, and the system that's currently in place, which is basically coming to our port and then rail east. So it's that kind of search for efficient, swift, clean technologies and systems that can serve both the capacity needs, global competitiveness, and the environmental needs. That's the big search in Southern California right now. Yeah.
Another opportunity would be the transit fleets of all the different transit agencies and the buses. So I'm wondering what you're doing, if anything, to work with all those different transit agencies that have different models.
Yeah, it's a lot. photos I had there, I went through very quickly in the interest of time, but is an battery electric bus operated by Foothill Transit Corporation. The neat thing about that one is they've got quick chargers at either end of the route. So the bus, they're targeting 24/7 operation with no downtime for charging. Basically, the bus stops for 10 minutes at each end. There's a quick charge connection at the top, charges up the batteries, and away it goes. And it's just a matter of a few minutes. So that's one. Fuel cell buses are being operated in some places, and so those are the kinds of technologies that can achieve pure zero emissions. Definitely feasible. The big issue is getting the cost down through greater production and the efficiencies of producing more and more units. Yeah.
Okay, and we have some questions from the web, and so a couple of questions. One, some people saw that graph about the cancer risk, and they kind of wondering how that kind of health impact is put into the context of, in terms of cost-benefit analysis, in terms of health impacts, what's the weight of that in the kind of final kind of policies or decisions that you make?
Right. Well, we do cost-effectiveness analyses on rules that we adopt. Our agency does not have authority for most situations, I'm going to qualify it with the lawyer hat on again, to regulate emissions from mobile sources. Our regulatory authority is limited to factories and power plants and other stationary sources. We do have the responsibility, however, for preparing the air plan for the region, which includes measures to be adopted by other agencies. And so we do a cost-effectiveness analysis, and we will measure the cost-effectiveness of measures against past measures for that particular pollutant to see if the particular measure compares favorably. We generally don't use that kind of analysis, though, for toxics such as cancer-causing agents, and those are in a different league, really, from a regulatory standpoint, because currently there's no federal standard like with the ozone standard or the particulate matter standard that says you have to get there by a certain deadline. For cancer risk, there is not that kind of a standard. But it's certainly considered. The costs are considered, but we don't really have the kind of benchmarks that we have for what are called the criteria pollutants that lead to ozone. I don't know if that was a clear enough answer, but it is an issue that's considered. Let me put it that way. But there we don't have the same kind of benchmarks.
So more questions from the web. Some people are asking why, or if you think about biking and pedestrians in terms of when you think about technologies in terms of reducing trips, so you reduce emissions and pollution at the same time, that, some think that they didn't see that kind of pushing that option as an alternative, and thinking also, I guess, more the planners thinking about growth management and how, you integrate and break down the silos in terms of, planning together for the future.
Yeah, no, the only reason you didn't see that is because I was limited in time, and so I was focusing on, particularly I wanted to focus on energy in this presentation, but bicycling and other means of reducing vehicle miles traveled is something that's a very big part of the regional transportation plan, and that actually becomes part of our air quality plan. So yes, very, very, very important. But one key message that we have is that we really can't get to the air quality standards without cleaner technologies. I mean, there's the use side, the vehicle miles traveled, and there's also the technology side. And that technology side, we're just not going to get there without going to the very, very clean technologies. Any other questions?
Go to the...
Sure.
It's kind of a broad question, but I was curious, with all the new technologies, are there issues with requiring proprietary products? Yeah, I guess this one.
Mm-hmm. We enter into a lot of contracts to develop and demonstrate technologies. This is an issue that does come up sometimes when we are co-funding the development or demonstration of technology. Should the agency receive royalties, for example? And I don't, it's not really an entirely settled question. We generally don't do that, though. But I don't know, what kind of proprietary issues are you referring to?
I guess I was thinking of if like a certain product was being pushed as something that could mitigate some emissions issues, and would you have to require that something equal to that could be used if you suggested that as an example?
Well, we would not adopt a rule that said you have to use XYZ Corporation's technology. We've set emission standards, and that's also true at the federal and state level. So that any company that can achieve that emission standard is, can qualify its products to sell. So, of course, sometimes there's a leader in the private industry, but that's good. I mean, there's an incentive there for them to move ahead. Yeah.
You mentioned through the course of the presentation a variety of different categories, I suppose, of ways to hit these targets. The ports, public transportation, private transportation, et cetera, and environmental justice and whatnot. And I'm wondering if your agency focuses its energy on one of these categories more than the others. Maybe you focus on the ports, or maybe you focus on environmental justice more than the others.
We don't see those as mutually exclusive. The ports are surrounded by relatively low-income communities. And as I mentioned earlier, on that map, that cancer risk map, I mean, you can go right up the I-710 and the 60 feet, the major freight corridors, and the same kind of thing is true. So we view focusing on the ports as being important because of just the enormous volume of freight traffic that originates and is destined towards those ports. But focus on environmental justice is, it just goes hand in hand with that. But again, it's not just the ports, because there's these corridors and there's rail yards throughout. In fact, the rail yard with the highest cancer risk that we have determined is in San Bernardino, which is quite a ways. It's about 40, 50 miles from the ports, but it just happens to be a high volume rail yard. So we don't view one or the other issues mutually exclusive. Yeah, right.
This may be a really common sense question, but in regards to the mass amount of warehouses, what would the process look like for getting that area covered, the rooftops covered? I don't know if it'll be like tax incentives or.
We're looking at the incentives. The state is developing incentives. I mean, that's actually a very important issue, because there's a lot of benefits to having the solar right here, rather than. I mean, it's important to have some of the big projects which are being proposed now for the deserts, solar thermal, but having it local creates a lot of benefits in terms of you don't need transmission lines and other benefits in terms of this operation of the electricity system. So we're looking at incentives, and the state has created incentives for that, and we're hoping to next maybe fly in 5 or 10 years and it's going to look very, very different. Yeah.
You mentioned the co-benefits, looking for co-benefits between local air pollution and climate change. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you had if you've yet come across any glaring examples of competition between those objectives.
Well, I wouldn't say competition, but there are strategies that will help one but not the other. I mean, for example, if you want to do carbon sequestration, well, that's not going to help the local air pollution. If you want to have foreign offsets, it's going to help greenhouse gases perhaps, but it's not going to help the local air pollution situation. And there's a few examples. So that's why we're trying to have single investments, multiple benefits is mantra.
Just one last question. Some people were wondering how the unemployment and the economic crisis and the general budget situation is affecting regulation and how you move forward in the political, socio-political sense in terms of the climate for this, moving
Sure.
towards.
Well, the economy is tough. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And so this is an issue that always comes up. That was one reason I put up that slide showing the rather massive level of growth that we've had at the same time that emissions have gone down, because we don't view that the environmental protection and robust economy as being necessarily in conflict. You just have to be smart about the strategies. And there's a lot of resources coming, particularly through those ports. And there's about $1 billion of goods coming through every day, those ports. And so some of these strategies, that we're talking about, the cost, while they're costly, pale by comparison compared to the value, the economic value of what's coming through there. Oh, I don't have it on here. I have it on my laptop. I'd be happy to. I can put it on there.
Maybe we can close the
Anybody's
seminar now,
interested
and
afterwards.
if you want to stick around to see the video. Thank you.